This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Utz McKnight, professor in the Department of Gender and Race Studies at the University of Alabama, where he teaches courses on political theory in a Black studies context. McKnight is the author of 4 books: Political Liberalism and the Politics of Race, 1996, The Everyday Practice of Race in America, Ambiguous Privilege, 2010, Race and the Politics of the Exception, Equality, Sovereignty, and American Democracy from 2013, and most recently, Frances E.W. Harper, A Call to Conscience from 2020. In this conversation, we discussed the power of Black studies for thinking nation, community, and democracy, and the challenges of questions of diversity, class, and gender in the field. Utz McKnight, it's great to see you and have a chance to talk with you today about future of Black studies, its past, and all of that. I really appreciate you making the time for us to talk today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, obviously, I want to ask you some questions about, your thoughts on the past of the field, present practices, questions we should be asking in the future. But I wanted to start really with a general and personal intellectual question, really inviting you to talk a little bit about your intellectual journey into study of race, into Black studies, and just ask, what kind of questions draw you into the study of Black life, and what is it about those questions and those concerns that really sustain you? Because of course, every bit of teaching and scholarship and program building requires real emotional time and intellectual investment. So I'm just curious to hear your own sort of journey into the field, but also what sustains you to stay working in this.
So, looking back on it, I can see the irony now. But when I was 19, I had a class with one of John Rawls's former PhD students, Charles Bites. And in that class, we were reading Theory of Justice. And I was political science, right, as a major. And he said, you've done the reading last night. Here it shows why Black people are obligated, in spite of the problems of racism, to adhere to a type of sense of political liberalism, right? And I raised my hand and I said, it doesn't make any sense to me, right? There should be civil disobedience, all this stuff that's, part of it. I wasn't wrong, but Charles shot me down, right? Dr. Bites. Yes. And that actually spurred me. I was like, forget this. Like, this is not right. And so I need to look at political theories and stuff like this that address this problem of why should we have to, the classic thing is Locke, the highwayman example, right? The highway stuff is like, if you're paying for public utilities and all this type of stuff, you should have been like all that stuff. Well, it was that space actually at 19 that has been consistent for me. It's like, what? Like, we're part of this society. And there's all the stuff that we're experiencing is that we should have, what does political equality look like? Right. Not social equality, not being able to sit there and drink coffee together. Right. Because we've always had stuff like that under terms of subordination or not, or whatever have you, but political equality. Right. So that has been the driving force for me. It's ironic just because I'm looking back on, 40 some years, going like, wait, that still is the call. The call to action is like, we have to create a society that allows for a type of equality that we have yet to achieve. We don't know, we won't even maybe know when we get there. But we have to create the conditions by which we could get to there. And that for me, Black studies, and I've been in programs, I've done work on immigration, I've been in ethnic studies, I've been in African American studies programs. Now, this is my 11th year as chair of gender and race studies, which is a blended program of African American studies and women's studies. Now we actually added sociology. We took it from another part of the campus. I've always been in these spaces. No, I think the motivation, that's abstract. I think the motivation for me has been that this is, and let me flip it around. It is crass to say this, but it is true that Black people define the democracy in America.
Mm-hmm.
So, the work that I'm doing, without putting any credit on me at all with this, but me as part of a larger community is trying to ask those questions that allow us to have, all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
A better society. And so who would shirk this? What kind of person, doesn't take this up as a gauntlet? And then I identify those people. I'm like, oh, you don't really care about this? This is actually what it's about. It's not about whether you're Black or white. It's about how we should define good enough relations,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and a good enough fleshing out, let's say, of the constitutional politics and law and stuff like this. So it also means that the work I do goes, as a political scientist, goes from legal issues all the way over to like public housing in Alabama,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as a matter of fact, I just was talking to engineering. There's a big grant about electric vehicle in use in the rural, impoverished areas of Alabama. We're doing a big study on how to get like charging stations and things like this, so there's a wide range, but it's about what's good for us as a society,
mm-hmm.
right? How to make things better. I hope that answers,
No, it does. I mean, it's, it's a conversation I have regularly, both with students and colleagues and friends about this, the foundational concerns of Black studies, which you just described in terms of, material questions of equality, as well as abstract questions of how do we imagine justice and community and society. These aren't boutique questions. The questions, the second we turn on a light, the second we grab our mail out of the mailbox, the second we log on to read the news, this is absolutely the substance of our everyday life rather than a boutique concern. And that's, I'm really happy to hear you say that, because I think thinking about Black studies as a boutique concern or a side concern rather than foundational,
at some level, I think of it this way. Now, what I mean by that is there are other ways that I also have to consider it. But of course, when somebody says like this, they go, why do Black studies? Why study it as a student?
Mm-hmm.
And I go, well, really what it is you're addressing a whole range of questions, everything from physics, right, to physics and chemistry and geology and geography, to things like literature, right,
mm-hmm.
English, and anthropology and history. What you've done is you've decided to take a particular population as indicative. You could take widgets. It just happens to be African American studies, right? And the African American population and around those issues, it's the same with women's studies, right? I'm not saying it's the only way to look at it, but if you look at it that way, you can say to somebody what you get, and you can tell I'm routinized, but talking this way, right? With a whole sea of parents and students looking at me, right? And I go like this, what you can do is you can ask questions of, let's say, what's affordable housing? But you can also ask questions about what counts for success as an investment banker. Mm-hmm. You can ask practical questions. You can ask questions of resource use and climate change. You can ask, like, all the questions can come through a study of one particular population.
Mm-hmm.
And all it is then, in other words, you take an application. It's almost like an application. So Black studies is not one thing. It's not lit. It's not history. It's not, it's also psychology. It's not just the psychology of race and stereotype and prejudice and all the studies, intergroup relations. It's not just that, right? It's like for me and my work, it's like, what is race as an idea?
Mm-hmm.
Such that it's so pervasive and persistent. And when we say it's not in a space, what do we actually mean when we're saying that? Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then when we say somebody is a racist or what racism is, right? I'm like, hey, people, this is not a superficial conversation. What do we actually mean? And most of the times, our definitions collapse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're left with like, oh, well, here's evidence over here. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, and then quickly we're like, no, that's not actually evidence. And so what is it about something that leads to so much injustice and inequality that is just pervasive? It's just like, and don't say, we know you can't retreat into the human condition or something like this. Or, so it's just it can be applied, and it's a good way to approach how to look at your world.
Mm-hmm.
But it also can be extremely abstract. And we can talk about the writings, let's say, of Toni Morrison without any, turning around and saying, well, how did you experience last Tuesday when you went to the coffee shop? We don't have to do that. We can just be like, so what's it like to be a writer? Look at, Playing in the Dark by Toni Morrison. She talks about the problem of racism, but she's also talking about her life. And how she can be a writer. Or Ellison, right? What's it like to be a Black writer? What's the Blackness in the writer? So it allows us to talk about, it's almost you can both be very applied, but you can also ask the meta questions of how we walk through the world. So it's very exciting. It's not for everybody. That's okay. We don't have to, that's the thing is we don't have to eat everybody. We don't have to encompass everything. But what we do have to do is be in the room. Because if you don't have this type of application, our world is a poorer place.
Yeah. And also we can't have everybody because as a chronically understaffed, a series of departments, maybe not too many majors.
That's true.
Well, this leads really into the second question I have, and in some ways you've already addressed it. But one of the things that also really interests me about the field of Black studies is thinking about how we imagine it now in 2024, which is just an absurd year for us to be in. Still adjusting to 2024 as a number, but thinking about imagining the field now, and then thinking about it in relation to its origins, because its origins, there's really two sort of foundations at that origin. One is obviously student protests of, we demand representation on this campus. And one of the ways to do that is to have a Black Studies department. I mean, San Francisco State. I know you're from the Bay Area, so this is close to home. But alongside that, and it's not opposed, but also the relationship is always interests me, is the birth of an intellectual tradition, right? Yeah. The demand that, like, look, literature, history, philosophy, sociology, all these departments, they represent very little, if any, Black life. Yeah. Let's have a place where the documentation of Black life and literature and critical theory and so forth, let's honor and develop that tradition. So there's the intellectual tradition dimension, which is deeply involved in the academy and what intellectual life does. But there's also the community and student demands around radical racial politics of inclusion, but also disruption. So I'm curious how you imagine the field sort of in relation to those two things of a sort of insurgent political movement, which, in these debates, Manning Marable was a leading voice for so long. And then the intellectual tradition, which Henry Louis Gates in their debate, right, sort of represented. And sort of in 2024, I'm curious to hear you think a little bit about that relationship, how you imagine the field and these two foundations.
Well, I mean, I think every department will be different, just like every university is slightly different in their relationship to the community. I mean, I think the thread of intellectual development, meaning asking questions. Well, maybe I'll say it differently. So I recently wrote a book on Frances Harper. That book, Frances Harper was the most important, most well-read, popular poet for 50 years, the last part of the 19th century. Almost no one knows that today, right? All of her chapbooks, all of the sort of stuff, that she did has disappeared. She was an incredible public intellectual. None of that work would be available without the research of African American women professors in the 70s and 80s. Without that work, so what the community activists in the 60s were asking was actually more right than they understood maybe at the time. And that is, wait a second, what's our contribution? Like we need our contribution to be front and center. It's a little bit of a sort of coincidental in one way, but part of the recent political stuff, renaming and all of this type of thing. That's one, like a reimagining the role of Black people in the society. But more importantly, intellectually, there have been real contributions by Black scholars within Black studies or, affiliated, et cetera, to reworking how we came to be this society and what the tensions are and the problems are. We can see evidence of that because 50 years ago, none of this material existed.
Yeah.
Like it's not that we had one view of history only, it's that we were just missing whole pieces.
Yeah.
Right. And we were missing also, it's one thing to add in Du Bois and others like friends of mine do to the conversations with Locke and Mill and, Rousseau, right? It's a completely different thing to say, wait, they're asking some other questions. There's some other questions that have not been addressed by philosophers. They might have seen them and they mention it, but they elide or glide over or don't care about them because they're not important. Whereas these are actually very important to, if you think about the United States, there were times when the Black population, during slavery and then after slavery was 50% of the population of some places. So the questions that would rise from those populations really matter. If you believe in equality, these are, 50% of the human population has these questions that are not being addressed. Yeah. So, the question you're asking, of course, is about the politics. So and this is where it differs. Some departments, I believe, have to be they have to work more with the local community because the relationship of the university to the town and gown thing, the relationship of the university to the larger community is different. So, without talking about my university at all, where I've been here for 21 years, I'll use a place where I was before as a professor, UC Berkeley, without being you'd have to be a little careful, right? The relationship, the work of the Oakland student community, the public, Oakland and their agitation and San Francisco, et cetera, went ahead and were pushed for the Institution of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. A similar thing occurred here at Alabama, right? The relationship that UC Berkeley has to, let's say, Oakland is filtered through the different ways that the university itself as an institution addresses problems of residential development, companies, all the different pieces of the university. So African American Studies reflects that, right? So here at Alabama, differently, and I don't mind talking in this way, the African American, Tuscaloosa is 60% African American, right? And so they ask questions, hey, what should our relationship be to African American Studies? And we're very involved in all the different projects somebody would have as an academic institution. Like everything from research studies to participating in, commemorating a march or something like this, right? We're not appreciably different than other departments on the campus. Let's say like individual professors in English wanting to be involved or something. But we're not the need to agitate from outside to develop something on campus is no longer there, right? Instead, the university depends on us having a pretty reasonably good relationship with all parts of the larger community, right? And And so but we are at the same time sensitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're very sensitive to the needs of everybody, right?
Yeah.
And so in a time like right now where things are sometimes considered pretty fraught, right? We just have to be attentive to it. But honestly, in the classroom and on campus, you wouldn't notice that. You wouldn't notice any politics, because the department, Black Studies is not, it's not actually dependent on a politics in a direct sense, right? Instead, it was a choice by the university to create this type of institutional structure. And that doesn't depend on the needs of one group of people in 2024 as opposed to 2030. Like if you think about the university, it's not actually as sensitive to the larger population. It's part of another ongoing project, right?
Yeah.
And I do know that when I mentioned Berkeley, for example, in Alabama now, where I've been, and I know you've been in Amherst and other places, and Maryland now, you can see that we are part of something that matters to the university.
Yep.
And so we're not as sensitive, but no one should say or think that we're not attentive, right? That there's a difference between saying, they don't care. And it's another thing to say that individual faculty members and different departments is like, does English care about the state of literature outside of the boundaries of the campus? It does.
Yeah.
So it's not, I know I didn't answer directly, but I
no, this is, I think part of what I'm hearing, I just did want to mention, Frances Harper, of course, Maryland native. So, exactly. It's a part, the amazing, number of important, African-American, figures from the state, to put it lightly.
Yeah.
She's up there.
And Maryland was very important for her.
And it's a great book, by the way. I read it. I learned so much from it. So I want to give just a little side pitch for it. But I think, you answered the question directly. And part of what I'm hearing, and, this is an important question for Ashley and myself to ask in these podcasts, because I think it both says something about, as you were saying, about particular institutions and the places they're in, but also about what it means to have a relationship to origins of a field that are so recent, but also very distant, because things radically change. I just think, we're here in Prince George's County at University of Maryland, and 50 years ago, when the department was founded, it was a completely different demographic, just the county, right? The state and the region, the area as maybe, not quite as dramatically different, but, everything evolves from its origins, but also, when you were talking about that attentiveness to community questions and university and community questions, those aren't stable at all. And so for me, they're really interesting because we can idealize the origins of radical students and insurgent kind of pressures. Sure. But, San Francisco State wasn't like, hey, yay, this is exciting. We're going to found a Black Studies program. They were scared, right?
That's right.
Maybe a little bit afraid for their lives.
Right.
And
that's right.
But now you're like, we need to elevate Black Studies, and most universities that have them, while, maybe not being as generous with money and FTE lines, we are valuable. But at the origins, it was a scary, controversial.
Well, at the origins, it was also a question of like, wait, is there something we've neglected and we haven't done? And so people will react defensively. Like, what does this mean for us if we're going to have this? And the students were pointing out, going back in the material, the students are pointing out, hey, it's already here. It's just not being discussed in a way that allows us a positive kind of space to thrive. Right. And that it's not about the Black students, it's about everybody, right? And so we've always had, if you look back, you always had people doing research, like, remember sociology, right? Chicago. You always had people doing research on Black life.
Yeah.
The question in the 1960s was like, hey, we've actually reached a time in our society and its development around these issues where we kind of need this thing.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, people react, nervously. But now, 50 years on, I mean, it's important to remember now I'm in my early 60s. When I was born in 62, Black studies didn't exist.
Yeah.
And when I was looking around for a PhD program, those things, let's say in the 80s, right? All the programs were just in their nascent phase, right?
Sure.
And very, very few, if any, PhD programs, right? So, this Black studies, for me, on the one hand, there's the politics, like, we feel threatened or not or whatever, but it's also an incredible statement about the ability of the university to address things needed in the society and to grow and develop. Because in these 50 years, it's not, what do we do 50 years on? We will continue to do what we're doing, which is, the things that matter to the larger society will be reflected in the department, just like they are in history or English, right? Or physics. Like actually, the sciences are an easy sell with this. Like biology responds to the needs in the larger society, and they get grants and they get funding. And actually, African American studies is exactly the same thing, even if we could wish for more funding.
Yeah,
and people, because people are in their feelings and sensitive about it, they feel that, but the irony is actually they know that these things are important to them. And so therefore they fight on different positions. Yeah. And our job is made difficult because we have to convince them, hey, the way you're looking at this is not correct. And nobody's excluding anyone actually, right? Because the questions are about all of us and everybody's going to benefit. Nobody, like if you're having an argument about the problem of inequality, the outcome is equality, right? It's not distributing the inequality to somebody else. That's not what anybody is. That's not the outcome, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Anyway, I don't want to go on too much about it.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, this, you've in some ways started to address this. Your training is in political science, as you said, sort of in the moment. I'm just trying to think. I think like maybe UMass and Temple would have been your options for a Black Studies PhD. So you're trained in political science. Your work is deeply invested in the political theory side of political science. And so I'm curious for you how you think of that disciplinary training, right? But as focused on Black life. How do you think that relates both to the past of Black studies and also continues to push boundaries in key elements of the field?
So in political theory that works with the issue of race, let's say you have, and I'll use, I'm not going to put them in those boxes, but let's say you have Stuart Hall on the one hand, what he represents in terms of Birmingham cultural studies tradition, the Black British tradition. You have then bell hooks on the one hand too, and then you have, let's say, Henry Louis Gates. So you have the way I just said it now, without going through a long list of people. I'm just saying people that most people interested in Black studies would recognize these three names. As placeholders, right? They're not adequate or inadequate or whatever, right?
Sure.
One is the sort of black feminist tradition, right? One is sort of Black Marxist tradition. Yes, we could use different people, Cedric Robinson. We could use different people, but but I want to also include the international part with Stuart Hall in that. And then you've got Gates as sort of liberal race political theory question, liberal Black politics question. So from the 60s, alongside that sort of protests and the development of the institution, you had questions of, what does race mean? Both in democratic theory and theories that are not advocating for democracy as a larger idea, the big D, right? What comes out of the labor movement tradition in Britain, et cetera. What comes out of the questions around the role of women and gender politics and sexuality also. And then the sort of more with Gates the questions of what does this mean for participation, civil disobedience, especially in the 1960s. So political theory has been a core part of that tradition of thinking since the development of Black studies. So for me, it's relatively easy. I personally tend to be, I'm much more of a continental theorist, right? So I'm much more in the space of asking questions around problems that Stuart Hall and others would recognize. But, most of my friends here in the United States, and remember, I was educated in Europe, and so I had that tradition, right? Most of my friends, feel that the liberal theoretical tradition is something to be adhered to in a different way. So, and then all of us, because of my work in gender and race studies, but also because of my own personal research interests, and my own trajectory, I found that the feminist analysis of the problems of the workplace and also social relations were really, really important to bring into Black studies. Like really, like they were, it's almost as though, hey, there's some answers over there. Let's reach out there. Right. In feminist theory. And then there's some answers over here, and let's bring those pieces together because actually they can grow together. We can be better. We can create some better arguments. So for me, that's been my relationship to like political theory. I have friends who say, let's just add African-American studies things into the political theory canon. I don't disagree with them that that's important, but I actually think that Black studies asks some very important questions to political theory as a discipline. Like it really does.
So, I mean, in some ways, you've already taken a couple steps into this question, because I'm also curious about how, your own interest in political theory, both, in terms of your training, which I say training, but it's also funny to talk about it when it's been, decades since we were graduate students.
What did I learn?
Yes. Yeah, don't ask me that. But I'm curious, about that interest in political theory, and then you've talked about, of course, about African American studies and political theory and that relationship. I really like that, like the critical questions that Black studies asks of political theory, not just that political theory can adopt. Yeah. But of course, you're in a gender and race studies department, and so I'm curious how your orientation, I should say, instead of training, maybe your orientation in political theory around Black life, how working in not just a multidisciplinary department, but a multiple ways of thinking about multiple disciplines, because gender studies and race studies, they do ask different questions, but they're both multidisciplinary in those asking questions. Right. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about the horizons that milieu in which you've worked has impacted your teaching and writing both.
Well, it's a hard question actually to answer. I think that the questions that occupy me now in terms of how I see the problem of race, gender, and sexuality in class, in the society, and I'll just say it in those categories, require training in all these different areas. In fact, there's too much to read. There are too many different issues, and so you have to make your choices. But the urgency of the work is immediate. And so what I worry about, and this is a kind of vulnerability, and maybe it's not a good space to do that. What I worry about is that I've missed something that I should have read. I've talked with some of, obviously we run into a lot of people who are quite a bit of fame and exposure. And I remember talking to somebody, his name's Stanley Cavell, and Cavell he said like this. I said, well, what about, confronting him as you do when you're a junior scholar, Yeah. Said, well, what about race?
Those are fun moments.
Yeah. What about race? But he was alone. Like it was just me and him. It wasn't a public kind of,
yeah.
And he said, race is about fear. It's just about fear. And this is ordinary language philosopher, and And I was just like, that can't be right. But it meant that I went down, as we say now, a rabbit hole of reading about the problems of, all sorts of things in psychology, certainly. But also about how you could think of, everything from Wittgenstein to a whole bunch of other like language games and things like this. What I worry about is not having read enough. And then you and I don't allow ourselves to be paralyzed by that. We still write, because by writing, and this also has to do with the classroom, my classrooms are unstructured and fun. And I am always surprised by the way that other human beings respond to things and learn from them, always. As a matter of fact, I like the challenge. It's not about somebody being hostile or something. I like the idea of, hey, I don't know about this, but I can tell you the different presuppositions and all this. I can tell you the concepts that go into this. And then the student turns around and says, yeah, I did the reading. And what about that? And so that Black Studies is about that core curiosity, the intellectual journey itself, right? So I know you're asking, so the other way to look at it, you're asking about more theoretically important stuff. The other way to look at it is I've talked to many, many people. I don't know. Let me throw Cornell under the bus, right? Cornell West, right? Talk to Cornell, and I mean this, like, talk to Cornell, and I go like, hey, we really don't have a comprehensive theory about Black life and race in America. And Cornell, without any hesitation, goes, yeah. It's like, we don't have an answer. Like, if we had an answer, if we had one thing, if we had a script, a recipe, right? And so there's so much more work to be done. Like, it's not that we don't know pieces of things. We don't have, huge structures of intellectual concepts. And it's not that we don't have all that stuff, but, answer the question for me of the importance of chemistry in human life. I mean, it's all over the place. I'm just saying, right? Maybe it's a stupid way to talk about it, but what is literature for the human condition, right? So what is race and Black life? So I know where I sit with the theories that I find interesting, but it also means that I can sit, and I do, and you know this yourself. I sit alongside at dinner or lunch or just talking in a seminar with people who have very different things they're interested in. But what brings us together is this idea of Black studies. Right? And that means that, it's especially the principle of gender and race studies is we're always working together. All the classes are across this African American Studies, Women's Studies, right? And that's a principle, and also it requires training on the part of faculty. If they feel that you're not able to say, hey, I can't teach, women's studies, or I can't teach African studies. And then I'm like, what do you mean? Like, they're all connected in. Yeah. It's not that you elide or eliminate differences, right? But they are all connected, right? I don't know. I hope I answered.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm especially struck with this, this anxiety, or I don't even know what the right word would be, but this troubled feeling of, have I read enough? I think that's the healthiest thing we can have as scholars, but it's also potentially the most paralytic, because, it could make you not want to say anything.
Oh, that's right.
But part of why I wanted to ask you about that in a gender and race studies department is because those questions that, say, you're training in Black studies and political theory, the questions that you in texts that come to mind are going to be different by right. your compatriots in the department, and that's a wonderful thing when we're interested in learning, and as stirs your belly with nerves a little bit when it comes time to write, because it does mean there are these other interests, and
imagine, let me say like this: imagine being in a place where people had very different training and ideas, but had the same kind of calling to,
Yeah.
Imagine a situation in which you're having a conversation where the person on the other side of the table has knowledge that you don't have. That's incredible.
That's exactly where I was going. That moment of that anxiety. Yeah. No, I mean, this is, you filled in the rest, which is, it can be anxiety, or it can be, this is why we work together, because somebody else asks questions that I don't. And
that's what I steer people in that space. Like, as the chair of the department, the faculty who come in, because everybody's coming from different traditions, different institutions. And many of them come in obviously kind of like suspicious, or like, I'm history and you're English or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to spend the time instead saying, hey, you know what? We need to learn from one another. And so what we have as a core with our 18 faculty, tenure track and full-time renewable contract faculty, the 18 faculty, over time, you realize they begin to read each other's material.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
You know what I mean? Like they have, like, if I say Gates or Hooks or Hall, every faculty member has not just read those types of, figures, but a whole range of things, even though somebody is just sociology
Mm-hmm.
or just history. And you're like, so you really read like political theory, but your history? And they're like, yeah, of course I did. Because I wanted to know where your arguments were coming from. And I wanted to know what the class next to mine was doing so that we could work together. And so over time, you build this very, very rich environment for research and also the classroom.
Yeah. This is that for me it's not only like a really beautiful vision, but it's a vision that when it works, or when we engage it, is so invigorating. But it's also like, if we're talking about contrary this or contrary that, we are sitting in this space committed to liberation as a vision. We are working within a space worth sharing. We're not trying to destroy each other.
Right.
But I also think, you were talking about, as a teacher, I also think about how this can be such a lesson for how to read.
Yeah.
To read people not as this is the final story, and if they didn't get it right, or if they left something out, this is something to be burned to the ground, but instead, here's a partial contribution to a big project.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right. Think of it this way. What could be more fun and also more value?
Yeah.
You pay all this money, you go to this university, and you want it to have meaning and value for you. And what better transformative experience where you can come in there and you can say, wow, and you don't have to, no one is saying that you have to have one view, because implicitly there are many different perspectives. And so you can turn around and say, hey, you don't agree with these things, and that's actually okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's just important for you to hear how I look at things, let's say, and the other person is looking at them and saying, and I really care about it. Why do you feel that way?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are your thoughts on this? And so the sort of core intellectual project, it's not politics at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
Like people come from the outside and say things. And then I'm like, have you been in the classroom?
Yeah.
Like we have, everybody expects disagreement, and disagreement on things that they feel personally.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because that's what disagreement is,
There is joy in conversation, believe it or not.
Yeah. No.
Not everything is a CNN panel meltdowns.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Like, so we're not like that at all. And we are, there's just no partisanship at all. There's nothing like that. Like, I don't even know when I say it that way, I don't even know what that would look like in the classroom.
That's wonderful.
Space.
I love that.
And we're at Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so the reason why I'm saying it that way is because we're at Alabama, we have to be attentive. We have to create a space for intellectual, a kind of conversation that also attends to people's sensitivities.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important. And so Black Studies, it is self-aware.
Mm-hmm.
And the faculty are self-aware. They're like, hey, we're not trying to do these things. We're trying to figure out what would be the terms of a conversation.
Yeah.
Right. In which there is literature. There is a research tradition. It's not just hanging out, like, as you say, CNN. Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's, and of course they have their own trajectory in history too, but, in journalism, but for us, there is a strong, it's not just 50 years, right?
Yeah.
It's hundreds of years of work.
Yeah.
The texts are, the texts can be from the 1700s.
Yeah.
So
looking at the field, sort of past to the present, sort of two things. What's something you think the field has done really well? And what do you think is something that the field has not done particularly well?
I think that the field is always threatened to be captured by the larger institutional politics of the universities.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's difficult. I mean, this is true of all disciplines. And so it's a common, it's not special in that sense. It's not something that Black Studies has to be attentive to as a Black Studies program. But the difficulty is you get captured in the financial as well as sort of political development of the university. I don't think, we have to be careful of that. But your question is more like Black Studies itself. One of the things that Black Studies has done really well is, of course, it has, well, I'm going to take a step back. In the 1970s, when there was a big push for women's studies programs at the universities, there was an argument about inside or outside. Do you work inside traditional departments, or do you create an autonomous outside unit like women's studies?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then Black Studies. So if we pay attention to that, the question about Black Studies versus working in, let's say, English or sociology, right, around issues of African American life, the tension between inside and outside remains. Yeah. And so we may not have been as successful as we needed to be to understand that both things need to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not easy. It's the problem for us is we get absorbed as institutional units into other units because of the inside-outside tension,
mm-hmm.
right? And somebody says like this, well, I do African American studies, but I'm in history. Why can't I be part of Black Studies? Or why, those types of things. We haven't seen that sort of meta question as our responsibility also. Mm-hmm. Instead, Black Studies often has been a place where we're Black Studies and I don't know what you do, right? And we kind of need to be a little more attentive to that. And then there are substantive issues, like there are many fields, there are many areas of research that have, it's only 50 years old. There are an endless number of research areas that need, if you look at the archives, if you look at the types of questions in all areas of our lives, there's so many things that have not been discussed.
Yeah. In the first podcast in this series, well, the first one was Ashley and I talking about the project, but the first one with Charles McKinney at Rhodes College, he mentioned, he really focused on this very question of, he's in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's like, there's almost no Black Studies research on Memphis, Tennessee, you just broaden that to say how have we both expanded but also failed to shrink some of those moments of small places. Not that Memphis is a small place, but every place has its own particularities.
Once you realize how little work has been done that we actually need to make sense of our lives now, but also how we were raised and the future, like the questions that we need to ask about what happens in our society. There's just a lot of work. And Black Studies, I think a more expansive idea of what Black Studies is crucial for every university.
Yeah.
Right. And how important it is. Right. It's not as simple as, the humanities don't matter or something. And everybody goes like, well, actually, it does, It's like, I get that in a little small group of people who can get a lot of attention, you're saying, what's the value? Don't confuse a question about what's the value with it has no value.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me ask about this, address or sort of reframe that question of the inside outside that you were talking about, because one of the things that I think about a lot, and this is more like envisioning the future of Black studies, which goes beyond our lifetimes, unless we find some immortality drug that we then choose to take. I don't think I would take it. But I have this question, and so I ask it of people of, Black studies born out of this idea that in your literature, history, et cetera, departments, they're not treating Black intellectual traditions or social theory, empirical studies, et cetera, of Black life, right? And so you have Black studies because of this lack of representation, not even underrepresentation.
Yes.
So then what becomes the destiny of that field now, Black studies? Is it because it's multidisciplinary, and multidisciplinary, as you say, in a way is that, I think there is a real imperative to be even more expansive than we are. Yeah. So as we're expansive about that multidisciplinarity, it raises this question for me: is the destiny of Black studies to eventually go away? Mm-hmm. That to transform, let's just say English departments and history departments to the point where Black life is so central to their concerns that you don't need a Black studies department? Or is there a kind of thing that happens when you gather these multiple disciplines together that Black studies becomes something more than a multidisciplinary area studies and becomes something like a discipline with its own methodologies that can't just be dissolved it back into departments? So I'm curious how you envision the destiny.
No, I mean, definitely the latter, is that, coming together, we are stronger, better. We have, interesting ideas, but it goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's a part of the tradition that really, how do I put it? It doesn't matter how, in spite of the development where people do the inside-outside stuff, in spite of the development where people do things related to Black life everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. There will always be this question of, hey, what were the initial imperatives? If anything, and this is the political theory part of me, is that, I need an area where I can work on questions of concept development that are about what is race and gender and sexuality and class, such that they overwhelm a lot of our everyday conceptual issues and experiences and what have you. So I think you always need, that's why you have an outside, is you will always need some sort of place where you can ask questions. And it's not philosophy. Mm-hmm. I'm just the political theorist and do stuff adjacent to philosophy, so I sound that way, right? But the historian will have the same thing. Hey, I need a place where I can talk about how we're doing around issues, and this is what I meant by applied: race, gender, sexuality, like those things. It's one thing to have the one English faculty member, or 10 out of 20, or something like this. And it's another thing to say, hey, once we're all fine with the politics around race in a particular way, where we no longer see a difference, like this is a kind of contemporary conversation and fixation. Once we think that we no longer say the word Black, and therefore it no longer exists, around those types of tensions, I don't think we have to be concerned with that. That's not what this is about.
Yeah.
Black studies is about a certain type of application and a set of questions that have to be around one particular population, right? But that's why you can have gender and race study, right? I mean, no, it's an easy answer in one way, the way I did it, but I'm very positive. And I'm optimistic about the future of Black studies. There's no question. Like for me, I think as people get more sort of politicized around these issues, that's symptomatic of the importance of the thing.
Yeah, people get hyped up about things that are successful and ignore things as they fail.
Yeah.
But I'm especially struck by, the previous comment that you had made before I asked this question about the sort of destiny of the field, where, you're referencing Cornel West and, this, do we have a common script? Do we have a common script of Black life, a theory of Black life that we sort of work from? And if the answer is no, I mean, how can you imagine that being a question that's for anything other than Black studies? Because that script is not a disciplinary script.
No, that's right. No.
Yeah. So I take, if nothing else, take that away as a way of framing in my own mind, what we're doing here, right?
And it will continue.
What we're working around, working towards, contributing on the margins to some moment.
Past our existence, unless we have that immortality drug, you say, right? The little pill or something.
Yeah. So please write. You should write a book. The script of Black life, right? Just go ahead and make your stab at it. So
very nice.
Everybody will love and hate it at the same time.
Yes, that's great. That's exactly what we want.
But agonism is how traditions work, I guess.
That's exactly my point. That's exactly, and people will, people will not agree with me, which is the whole point.
Yeah.
Right. But this is why it works with us down here, is we're working in the messy part of human life.
Yeah.
Right? The things that people really do care about. They really do care about. So it's not that it doesn't matter. It will matter, and it will matter in the future. You're right. It will matter in the future. I know that's, for some people, it's like it shouldn't matter. Right? But that's not their choice.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for this.
Yeah. So let me ask you as a sort of final question. Some ways you've said multiple times in answer to the question, but what do you think of as, what is the most urgent question? If it was to be turned over to you, what is the urgent question for us in Black studies to be asking? What's the thing that sits with urgency for you?
So it kind of goes back to the politics question too. I think the most urgent question is, how do we build community from all of the work that we're doing? How do we build communities such that, we deal with some of the divisiveness and conflicts within the community? I'm talking about within the Black community. And the community idea is a very particular one, right? Mm-hmm. I do think that Black studies should be much more attentive to questions of why the division? Mm-hmm. What is that about? Beyond the agonism, beyond, why are things corrosive when they are?
Yeah.
Why are they? And that, I think that's the most urgent thing now is, yes, we've become captured by all the political winds. Therefore we respond. And it's like, why are we responding? Why are we responding in a particular way? Why don't we just sit there and say, hey, everybody says, what's the use of the university? Well, the value or use, sorry, I use that language, of the university is to actually be in a space where they can think about things and develop things so that we survive beyond one generation.
Yeah.
So our needs don't just become so immediate, and the sense of truth and right are not open to criticism, right? And I know I sound like, Socrates or something. Very straightforward. It's very straightforward. The Greeks worried about this. Everybody's worried about this. How do we create something that endures? In other words, an archive for the questions that we've dealt with, so that there's some future. And that's the important. And that's also Black studies. Like we have to, and I know I'm going on about this, but I was recently talking with somebody about this. We have to, a researcher in Black studies, we must, because we're 50 years old now, it's 50 years plus, we must make sure that new scholars understand the history of the tradition and have read more, not just take the bright and shiny conversation right now. They have to understand, what was it like for me when these programs did not exist, such that the questions I had to ask in my research were completely new. Right. And what I mean is very undeveloped. If you read the work in the 70s and 80s, many people would be impatient and say, why did they write about this like that? Without understanding that holding their time and thought that was the only way they could write about it.
Yeah.
And that's instructive for us in terms of the future. 50 years from now, you and I know we may be around, as you point out, right? But if we're not, people will be like, why did they ask those questions? But that doesn't mean you don't read it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you don't read according to how many the citations and stuff in the current moment.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, you read things that are obscure, not for their obscurity, but because they exist. Somebody put a lot of time and effort into writing these things.
Yeah.
Right. I know it's I'm just, pigeonholing myself as as an academic.
No,
I
mean, you're talking to one, so
I'm sorry. I apologize, everybody.
I love that, though. I think that's really important. That notion of reading and building traditions. I mean, I teach a lot and think a lot about those early Caribbean novelists, George Lamming in particular, who really asked the question, what does it mean to write a literature for an audience that does not yet exist?
Yeah.
Right. But also, what does it mean for us to read somebody writing for an audience who is not us?
Yeah. And imagine what they get out of that class when they read it. And then they don't say this. Nobody's ever said this before. Instead, they go, oh, well, this stuff that I've read. In other words, we build a respect for our population and the people and the academic tradition. Otherwise, we don't. And we become we can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
And therefore, we actually don't have progress. Right. So
I love that. It's a perfect place for us to end. We've been friends a while. I really love you as a friend. And this was just a really great opportunity for me to connect with you and hear about your thoughtful intellectual life in detail. It's really fantastic and really interesting. So thank you so much for the time.
Yeah. And thank you for the opportunity. It's fun. And, I care about Black studies.
So. Yes. we share that commitment. So, all right. Well, take care, my friend.
All right. You too now.